Okay, guys, wrapping up day one of Capital Audio Fest 2022. And I gotta say, it was a very impressive first day. I'm gonna give you some hits and misses though, and kind of highlight some of the things I already documented in the titles of my video. If you were following along today, you pretty much are gonna know the answers to these questions because nothing really changed most of the day. But let me go over, for those that couldn't watch all the videos, first of all, let me get the misses out of the way first. And again, two things. I said I was going to be very critical of setup, and so that's going to be part of the misses. But also, part of misses isn't critical of the company. It's just critical of nature of these shows and the fact that you got to rely on shipping and all kinds of other things to get things right, and reliability. So one of the most unfortunate misses was Retham. That's a brand that, if you followed me before, I've said they had one of the worst rooms I've ever heard in my life back when they used their legacy models, that single driver kind of thing and the transmission line. Unfortunately, and then at Exponent, they came out with a whole new design, very impressive. Unfortunately, those new designs weren't shipped in time, so he had to use a legacy model, and that's what we were listening to today. It didn't sound as bad as that one room, which had no room treatment and anything, was terribly set up and associated gear, but it just was disappointing because I was very interested in seeing that next level of rhythm. Now, another miss today was, unfortunately, the Goebel room, because they had a defect in their speaker. Now, that was a very impressive room at Seattle, and that new subwoofer, the main one, huge 18-inch woofer, was pretty impressive. And again, normally a good room. Unfortunately, he was blaming it on the CD player, but my experience when I've seen that, I was watching that driver. If you notice, I got up in the middle and went by that driver because I could tell which one was having trouble. It's the same problem I had with my Geo Research and Extremes. You know how I had trouble with a bunch of drivers? When the spider came unglued, it would do similar to what that was doing on certain songs at certain points, depending on how the resonance is. Because it's not totally unglued and acting crazy. And then I was able to get a friend of mine help me repair it. Unfortunately, he's not going to be able to repair it. He can change out that CD player, and I guarantee you he's still going to have that problem probably in that driver. So again, these aren't the things that you would blame the manufacturer on, but it's just unfortunate. So those are, quote, misses that you got to take into account and who to assign blame to. Sometimes it's just bad luck. Now, in terms of setup, really almost everybody did a great job with setup. And on the hits and misses side, there really aren't any major misses. I will say that subwoofer setup was the highlight of today. From the very start, I went into Duke Lejeune's room, the Elusio speakers, which is one of my hits of today. And not only those speakers on their own, the top end was really great. Very impressed for what Duke has now elevated his speakers in the refinement from his legacy models at Audio Kinesis. But the subwoofer setup is the 4 Swarm that JR with Wally Tools went in there with his proprietary method of doing it, and he's coming to my house to do that exact same thing with those 4 subs in January, so stay tuned for that. So this was a good taste for me to see what I could expect, and I was very impressed because you could not tell there were subs in that room at all, and everything sounded like it was coming from those speakers, which is very tough to do in a small hotel room like that. Even tougher to do with no room treatments, and even tougher to do with 4 of them, and one's way behind you in the middle of the wall. So I'm very anxious to see what his little techniques are and how he accomplishes that, but that was very impressive. On the flip side, sometimes when speakers had subs, there's one room that was both a hit and a miss at the same time. So the GTT Audio Works, I mentioned that being a speaker I wanted to check out, and yeah, it's a great upgrade over Maggie's. Dynamic, detailed, reference quality. Kind of reminds me of the Alcivox, which I've mentioned before is like a dream speaker of mine. If I went back to line source, line arrays, and had limitless funds, that I didn't care about price at all. But this is actually cheaper than the Aussie Vox and would be very competitive. Definitely would be one of the few speakers I heard today that I would consider owning. So in that respect, it's a hit. The one miss is that, and it's the same thing I kind of noticed at Danny's place when I listened to the NXtremes at his house, those open baffle subs. And again, this was a small room for those GTT audio. It wasn't really the ideal room probably for them. So you're much closer to them. Every time there was either low frequency information, either male vocals deep or anything like that, I heard my head almost turn to the subwoofers. They just localized to me. And I think it's not so much the setup, because I know those guys are competent setup crossover points, but just the proximity of being closer in these rooms to open baffle. As I mentioned before, these are huge bass drivers in an open cabinet. So just the disturbance of air on top of maybe not the most optimal crossover and timing stuff brought attention to it. And again, it's the same thing I heard with the open baffles occasionally at Danny's place, and I remarked about that in the very first video that I did on my Geo Research NXtremes, and it was exactly the same thing here with basically the exact same sub. So it's just a nuance, it's a nitpicky thing, but I told you I was going to be nitpicky at this show on setup, and so subwoofer setup is something we really want to pay attention to. That really shows where you elevate your performance, and kudos to the Infigo Elusio room. That was phenomenal. Another hit was obviously Linkwitz. Again, they didn't have as good a room as they had in Seattle. It was a little more confined, but what was really evident with that smaller room is I was really up close to those speakers. And instead of like most point source boxes and bookshelves and almost any normal speaker, when you're that close, yeah, it may be flat frequency response, yeah, it may be detailed, dynamic and all that, but you still know you're listening to just a great speaker. You're listening to those things producing the music because it's shouting at you. But with the Linkwitz, I was up close, but I was hearing the vocals behind the speakers. They presented the music, just outlined it in front of me without calling attention to themselves. Any of the drivers was very coherent, and again, a thumbs up on that. Really though, if I had to give an award to any room today as the biggest surprise and the one that I would probably recommend to the most people, it was that DR speaker, and it was $6,000. It was one I titled Best Budget Room I think I've heard all year. He had a mini DSP SHD in there, hollow DAC. He had very economical Crown amp, active crossover. He could do it with the mini DSP and without. He could use the hollow DAC, without the hollow DAC, and use the DSP, the mini DSP. That sounded great. I'm going to definitely go back, challenge it with some more material. But guys, that whole system was probably south of 10,000 or 12,000. He said, depending on how much you spend on cables and finishes and all that. That was just as good as almost any room here today. Because as usual, the big dollar rooms are part of the misses today. I just don't think some of these rooms are conducive for the high dollar cost. And like, I was very excited about the Hestia from Alta Audio. That's one brand that I really like, their previous models that I've seen at shows. And today I was really excited to hear the dipole Hestia, but I don't think it fit that room very good, and I didn't get the wow factor that I got actually for their lower models, especially their bookshelf. And their bookshelf at, I want to say it's under 5,000. I have to review them, but I just remember saying, this thing, he said you don't need a sub, but I like to play it loud and fill a room with bass. You could easily add a sub and still be well under most megadollar speaker budgets and get very similar performance. What else did I hear that was really good? Well, on a par, most everything was good. I want to say that the only disappointing things were things that were broken or poorly set up. The biggest miss, though, in terms of my critical, setup criticism that I would blame on actual people, not misfortune, was when I went into that room and saw these drivers and the Karma, I think they were Karma speakers, just basically the drivers were at max excursion, almost popping out of the cabinet. And I'm looking around and the room is full of people. Nobody's saying a thing. Nobody's wondering. They're only playing Tom Petty, not even that dynamic or loud, and that's no subsonic frequencies, but they're playing LP, didn't have a rumble filter engaged, and it's just making these drivers go crazy. And again, for you as a layperson or a casual audiophile, as a customer, totally fine if you don't know that that's a problem or what a rumble filter is, all these things, totally fine. I'm not saying you should be knowledgeable about that. But when you have people in the industry that don't notice this and don't say anything, and supposedly this has a bunch of experts and nobody in the room saying anything, I mean, it just baffles my mind. But we've seen it time and time again on YouTube, people blowing their drivers. They don't even know DC's being passed to their drivers. Owners of companies have even done that. I recently had a cable company that I asked them to supply cables that were under 20 picofarads of capacitance. And he turns around and calls somebody and says, yeah, we need to apply capacitors to the speaker cables. I mean, I was like, you're in the industry and you didn't understand what I just said, you know. So I am going to be a little more critical on those kind of things for you guys, because again, you don't need to know these things. It took a lot of time and understanding on my part over years to understand all these things, and I'm not an engineer by trade, but some of these things eventually you should know. But most importantly, people setting up rooms, people that own companies, people holding themselves out as experts need to know these basic stuff. And so that's just the feedback for today. Hopefully you enjoyed my coverage. I'll be back tomorrow with plenty more, and maybe upload some of the fun stuff tonight. As you can see, I'm dressed up. I'll show my pants maybe later tonight. So stay tuned, guys. I'll see you back here soon.